Welcome to another episode of Discussions with David. I'm live streaming some kind of interview or on Monday an open mic every weekday at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT. Every broadcast goes out live on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, KBOO Community Radio, and elsewhere. They all get archived in the Discussions with David playlist on my YouTube channel and in podcast form as well. If you don't want to miss any, subscribe to This Week with David Rovix on any podcasting platform. Today's guests, Luce Guillen-Givens and Garrett Fitzgerald, spent a good chunk of their 20s in and out of court being charged with terrorism in the course of the protests against the Republican National Convention in Minneapolis in 2008. Luce and Garrett are both longtime organizers and part of a significant community of actual real live anarchists in the city of Minneapolis, which has a long tradition of radicalism of all kinds, just as it also has a long history of violent repression of dissent. Luce and Garrett, I'm so glad you could join me for the hour. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate it, David.
It's mutual. And I wanted to start with the very, very broad but necessary question of can you guys maybe both describe just some kind of an outline of what has been happening in Minneapolis over the past week from your vantage points? I know it's a huge question, and just take a minute to think about how you're going to answer that. I know it's just too big, but this is what
Sure.
This is. Yeah, I mean, I could get more specific about it, but
Sure.
there's an uprising going on, and that it's multifaceted and complicated, and we got an hour, which isn't that much time, but we could start dissecting it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so to start, on Monday, May 27th, George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis Police Department. He was killed by a police officer, Derek Chauvin, kneeling on his neck for almost 9 minutes. The encounter was videotaped pretty much start to finish, and so people were able to see really the entire encounter all across the city, all across the nation, all across the world. There were protests starting on Tuesday, really huge, massive protests of people out in the streets. And sort of Tuesday night, those protests moved over to the 3rd Precinct, which is the nearest police station in South Minneapolis. And then since that point moving forward, there have been kind of two focuses of the protests, both the 3rd Precinct and the location at 38th and Chicago where George Floyd was murdered. And there have been things going on in the streets every day since then. The first, I would say, 4 days and nights of this ongoing uprising, there were really significant riots in the streets. Since then, there has been a lot of other protest activity that has continued, but in terms of rioting, that has really subsided. We've also been under curfew here since, I think, last Friday was the first night of the curfew, and the National Guard has been deployed since that day as well. I think, correct me, Garrett, if I'm getting this timeline wrong, but
That sounds right to me.
yeah. And I'm not sure right now if the curfew is going to be extended or not. And I think maybe the National Guard is drawing down, but I'm not entirely sure of the next steps with that.
Yeah, just like with the way that COVID stuff has been happening here, the Governor Walz likes to talk about turning the dials, that it's not an on and off switch that you turn it down. So I think what we can expect from him is less of a police state today. But I imagine that it's not going to just one day, we're not going to wake up and it's going to be gone. I think that one of the things that I'll add that seems really important to me anyway with all of this is some of the initial reports that the police that came out, the initial media that the police released about kind of what happened, their story of what happened before the video came out. To me, I think that really exacerbated the obvious, people's obvious like disgust about what happened, because not only did this murder occur, but then there was a cover-up, and that
because that's originally the police were saying totally different things from what they later admitted. Like they were talking about how George Floyd was supposedly resisting, and then that turned out to be not true. So that's what you're talking about, right?
And then also the passive language, like he died of medical complications, where it's like, no, he died because you crushed his trachea. That is why this man died, and that is what makes all the other officers complicit, not just because they stood there and watched it happen. There were one of the officers was across the street, and I think, I can have grace and be like, maybe he didn't know what was happening. I mean, still, he should quit his job. He shouldn't ever be a cop again. Nobody should be a cop ever. But then he was a part of the cover-up. They were all a part of the cover-up, and that I think is what really got to, I think, a lot of the folks who wanted to trust the police 2 weeks ago, was that they just saw this bold-faced lie. And it makes everybody that wanted to support the police, that liked the police, or whatever, had more complicated feelings about the police, say, how often are you lying to us? All of the faith, all of the good faith evaporated.
And it seems like a good moment just to mention that there's such a long history here with the police in this country and in Minneapolis in particular. I wonder if you could maybe talk about some of your experiences with police provocateurs and undercover police and uniformed police and their brutality in Minneapolis. I know that you've had experience with all of those forms of police activity in your adult lives.
Yeah, I mean, we had a lot of experience with brutal policing at the RNC. I think what is interesting about Minneapolis and Minneapolis Police Department specifically is that they really have, up until this point, or over the past 20 years, got the neighborhood policing thing down to a science, a solid strategy that they had going, and that these moments around the RNC, around this uprising, where you see that work that mask come off, I think is sort of a critical moment in people's understandings of the police. Luce actually helped write a pretty awesome article about community policing as a tool of counterinsurgency, and maybe she would want to talk to that more, because I think that's what we're kind of most used to seeing around here.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the history of the Minneapolis Police Department is the same as the history of all police departments, right? Which is a force that's by its nature, exists to serve the status quo, and that status quo is capitalist and white supremacist and, colonialist, and the list goes on. There is kind of a mixed history of policing here, which I do think is pretty interesting. So I think, as you were referring to, and as Garrett talked about, we were a part of organizing protests against the 2008 RNC that saw a massive and militarized police response, resulting in felony charges against 8 of us, a dozen and a half other people facing felony charges, and 800 plus other arrests, in addition to just extreme levels of brutality in the streets. And that's not the first time that local police departments have mobilized in a somewhat similar way. There was, extremely brutal policing of the actions at the Minnehaha Free State, at the ISAG protests a couple years after that. I think a thing to note is that in any of those situations, it's not just the Minneapolis Police Department, right? I mean, in fact, the 2008 RNC took place in St. Paul, and the major forces operating were the St. Paul Police Department and the Ramsey County Sheriff's Department. But in all of those instances, you have a joint operation by multiple different police departments across the metro area and the state even, right? National Guard, state troopers. I know for the 2008 RNC, there were small town police departments from all over Minnesota deployed to the Twin Cities. And I think that is maybe an important point that is getting somewhat lost in this really incredible moment, is that everyone is talking about the Minneapolis police and how awful they are, right? And that's true. But some of what we're seeing is other police departments or other arms of the state that are actually collaborators in that same system distancing themselves as if to suggest that they're not the same, right? So we have the Minneapolis Parks Department severing ties with the Minneapolis Police Department, saying that they're going to change their uniforms so that you don't visibly mistake them for the Minneapolis police, as if the Parks Police were really any different, and they're not at their core, right? So I think it's really important to push back on this narrative that the problem is the Minneapolis police rather than the police broadly. I think maybe to talk a little bit more about what Garrett was talking about in terms of kind of community policing. Yeah, Minneapolis is a really progressive place in a lot of ways. And I think that's real. And I don't think that's insignificant. I don't think that's all superficial. I think there are ways that Minneapolis is in fact a better place to live because of that. I don't want to like minimize what it means, but I think that in the past like 10 years, the Minneapolis police have developed a strategy of de-escalation at protests that actually you haven't seen, like say the level of brutality. Yeah, like the level of brutality that we saw in the 2008 RNC, for example, has not been repeated until now, maybe, and so many people coming into protest movements in the interim actually don't have a lot of direct experience here of the full extent of what the police are capable of at protests and what was common practice in the past. And I think I think this is a moment where that will change. I think things, we saw a total shift in that with the complete abandonment of the third precinct. And I think that probably moving forward, we're going to also see a much more kind of bald-faced, violent and repressive state in regard to protests. And all of that is alongside the fact that obviously the core violence of the police against not just communities of color, but any sort of marginalized community. I mean, a huge portion of people killed by police are white, actually, maybe have mental health issues or are poor, or, so that core violence against marginalized people has always been there and has never gone away, although the face of it at protests has looked a little different here in the past 10 or so years.
Ultimately, the terrible inequities in a society like ours must be enforced by the armed enforcers of the law. Otherwise, people will stop paying their totally outrageous rents and mortgages, and everything will just go to hell from the eyes of the capitalists. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I wonder if I know this is probably just conjecture, and we can do nothing but conjecture on this subject. But I wonder if the fact that Minneapolis, I don't know to what degree Minneapolis is known nationally outside of certain circles as being a place that is known for being progressive. But certainly in my social circles, everybody kind of knows that thinks of Minneapolis in the same thought as they think of, other sort of cities with a progressive tradition or one kind or another, strong labor tradition, and all this. But I wonder how much that might play into to this rebellion reacting to specifically cops in Minneapolis. I mean, if they're going to do this kind of brutality in Minneapolis or where Vermont or Seattle or whatever, then this isn't just Georgia, in the minds of people. Yeah, I don't know if that. Do you think that plays into it at all, or do you have any thoughts on that, or is it just hard?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think an aspect of it is, Minneapolis, while being a progressive place, is also a place that has tremendous racial disparities, tremendous class disparities, and I don't think that's what sets Minneapolis apart, but it's a reality that, is paradoxical with the idea of this sort of like progressive paradise. And so there's constant tension around that, and I think that's a huge element of what's gone into the response to George Floyd's murder.
What's your impression about? I mean, it's one of these things that's again like maybe hard to put your finger on, but in terms of what's exactly going on. But everybody who has been going to most all of the protests around the country that I've heard from is remarking on the intersectionality of the protests, and just what a diverse crowd it is at these protests. And I'm sure that a big part of that is that everybody is fed up with police brutality and police racism, but I wonder if it's also in the course of the pandemic, there's been ongoing rent strike organizing, a lot of mutual aid, a general talk of general strike, all kinds of other stuff was going on before George Floyd was killed and Ahmaud Arbery and everybody else in the past several weeks of wanton police murder. But there's been also a lot of other things going on. And I wonder how does that all seem to be playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I think there probably is an element of all of this that is the pressure that has built over the course of so many months kind of in quarantine. And, I mean, what that's actually meant has looked really different for different people, right? Some people haven't actually been able to, stay home and isolate, and other people have. But I think there probably has been a lot of kind of social pressure building, and as people is stuck in very precarious situations and isolated in ways that they might not ever have been before. And that probably has played into the way that this exploded. I do think it's one of the things that's really notable about this moment is the just near total condemnation of George Floyd's murder, like across all sectors in a way that I've never seen here before. And I don't really know that I've heard of or seen that anywhere in response to this kind of a killing, which are, unfortunately, these killings are in some sense fairly routine, right? The only thing that's different right now is the response. So the level of just total condemnation across all sectors, I think, is incredible. And I think in that way, yeah, I mean, it really is truly a diverse movement. And, being out on the streets, like, it has been a true diversity of people. I think one thing that I would love to see is, as people are discussing what's happening in Minneapolis, and maybe this is true other places as well, to allow for more nuanced discussion of what communities are actually impacted by this. So there's a lot of discussion of anti-Black racism. There's not a lot of discussion of racism more broadly and all the different communities of color that actually experience that, not just through police violence, but for example, the neighborhood that is been destroyed is a majority person of color, majority extremely poor part of the city, and it's gone, and that in and of itself is also, I think, an act of white supremacy and of capitalist destruction. And I think it's important to be able to talk not just about how beautiful it is to have such a diverse movement rising up here and everywhere, but also to talk about the fact that there are a diversity of people that have a stake in seeing justice in our world, and that we have to be, willing to make room for all of that and all of the different tragedies that are being experienced in this moment.
I wonder, one of the things I've read about, actually just because I am often reading about landlords and tenants and rent strikes, and so the digital powers that be are constantly sending me more stuff about that. In the echo chamber, once you're into something, then Google knows, and but I sort of accidentally, more or less, because it wasn't big national news, but I read about a very successful rent strike in Minneapolis that basically concluded recently, with the city basically doing a 0% interest loan so that the people living in the building can basically buy it from the landlord at what sounded like a pretty good price. I mean, do you know about this? What's been going on?
Yeah, I think you're probably talking about the Inquilinos Unidos Tenants Cooperative in South Minneapolis. Yeah, and so that is
write down.
Yeah, so it's, a struggle that's been going on for a few years now, that started with an organization called Inquilinos Unidos, working with tenants across many buildings throughout the city, who were all dealing with extreme habitability issues in relation to Stephen Friends, who's actually someone who the city previously had sold, but really given all of these buildings that were taken away from a previous slumlord. And so at the time, he was really championed as, this guy that was going to rescue all of these poor tenants that had previously been suffering under a slumlord. What was revealed is that he actually never stopped being in business partnership with the previous slumlord, and he himself was also a slumlord. He lost his rental licenses and was forced to sell most of the buildings. And then there were a few buildings remaining that over the past year, folks have been occupying without paying rent, in part because he was not legally able to collect rent because he had lost his rental licenses. And so they formed a cooperative, and I mean, really just stood their ground. They had ongoing eviction proceedings in court. The behind the scenes that whole time, they were also in negotiations with Stephen Friends, and for months and months and months, it looked like purely out of spite, he just wasn't willing to sell to them, not because he had another buyer, not because it wasn't a fair price, just because he didn't want to sell to the people that he felt had like robbed him of these properties. And then something shifted in the past, month. I think it was super recent that it happened. And he finally, under, I think, pressure from his business partner and also maybe changing financial conditions with the economic downturn around the pandemic, suddenly his own finances are looking pretty different. So he finally buckled and agreed to sell the buildings. So the tenants, they do have a cooperative, and they're basically receiving a lot of support from the city and from a land trust organization to transfer the buildings into the cooperative and start operating fully autonomously at some point. So, I mean, it's really an amazing victory for sure. And that's something that's happened. I mean, those buildings are just a couple blocks off of Lake Street, right in the epicenter of everything that's happened in response to George Floyd's killing too. So, I mean, we're definitely talking about the same community. And
they're okay right now, as far that community, the buildings and everything were not damaged or anything. I mean, it wasn't. I haven't heard that their buildings were damaged, and I would guess that they haven't been. I know that they are right, as am I, right in the Lake Street corridor, and that all residents in all of these neighborhoods definitely have felt a lot of fear and precarity over the past week at the fires and the intense destruction of infrastructure that people rely on, and also the recognition that the city would not come in to actually save people's buildings, people's homes, the infrastructure they need. And so there has been a lot of like neighborhood defense going on, and I would imagine that extends to those buildings as well. But I haven't heard of any specific destruction there or like threats to their buildings. So, have you heard of residential homes being targeted?
I haven't heard of residential homes being specifically targeted. Many of the buildings that were burned entirely to the ground had apartments in them. And a lot of buildings that burned were right up against homes that experienced at least some fire damage being in proximity. There definitely along the Lake Street corridor has been some destruction kind of extending into the adjacent blocks. So, just like occasional broken windows here and there. There's a neighbor's car burned out on the block behind us. So there's been some of that, but I haven't heard a lot of people's homes being directly and specifically targeted so much as a lack of regard for the fact that the ongoing, the fires in particular that were happening were in residential areas.
What the military in a war would describe as collateral damage.
Yeah, exactly.
This is not much of a question really, but I know that for many people in places like Portland, Oregon, where I am now, there's been very large scale protests for the size of the city and the size how protests usually are. I mean, several thousand people every day is big for Portland standards in recent decades. Yeah. But there's been a certain amount of trashing of mostly corporate stores downtown that represent multi-billion-dollar corporations, overall from what I've seen. But what has been going on in the Lake Street neighborhood is really a qualitatively completely different situation. And I wonder if, I don't know, what's it like living in a neighborhood where the main commercial street has been completely destroyed? Yeah. What are people doing when they want to go shopping for groceries?
Right now, there's nowhere for them to go. I mean, I will say that, the silver lining in this is that there has been just an amazing mutual aid effort emerging from this, and kind of donations pouring in from all corners of fresh food and other supplies, and coordinated distribution of that throughout the whole East Lake corridor. So the response, like any disaster response, is beautiful, and yet, it's a it's a disaster that created the situation where it was necessary in the first place, right? So, I mean, the neighborhood has essentially been turned into a food desert over the course of the past week. There's also a severe lack of access to pharmacies. I personally it took me now over a week to actually get an insulin prescription filled. Pharmacies in the neighborhood have either been burned down or looted and closed. So in terms of like critical supplies that people need, another thing to remember is that while this has happened and because of it, the Metro Transit suspended all transportation for a number of days, and now it's come back somewhat with ongoing suspensions related to the curfew. But so for a lot of people in this neighborhood, they don't have a way to leave. They don't have a way to go somewhere else. And even if they did, we're not talking like heading a couple miles in any direction to access this stuff. Sometimes it means going out to suburbs, maybe outer ring suburbs, to actually find the supplies that you need. So, I mean, the impact is huge in scope. Some places are starting to reopen, but of course, like, places that have the resources to be reopening are more likely to be the like chains and the places with corporate backing. So, the majority of what's been destroyed are local, small, often low-income businesses owned by, many of them immigrants and people of color. And those are the ones that are least well-positioned to sustain this sort of impact. So, the local Target is going to recover. I don't think anyone's too worried about them, but that's not most of what the destruction has been.
It seems like, yeah, it is. I mean, it's a lot of rage coming from a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons, and not the kind of focused property destruction that is characteristic of some black bloc events where corporate stores are targeted for political reasons or to try to combat rising housing costs. Because I mean, right. It's I don't know. I remember in New York City, the squatters who had a lot of neighborhood support, they all seemed to have a common understanding that the squats were keeping the cost of housing low by existing. Right. And so it was a symbiotic relationship, basically. Yeah. And makes a lot of sense. And by the same token, kind of having a pretty good, pretty high crime rate in a neighborhood also helps keep the cost of housing low. So it's a kind of, I wonder, I think about all these things in the context of what all the media talking about. They're destroying their neighborhoods. Like, I mean, just what is that? What does that feel like when you hear this kind of talk, or what is that? What are your intellectual reactions to that concept of this is people are destroying their neighborhood? Do people feel like it's their neighborhood? Or how many own houses in that neighborhood, and how many are rent-burdened renters? What is I mean, I know I'm asking too many questions at once, but how rent-burdened are renters in Minneapolis? I wonder how, because I don't hear about Minneapolis in terms of being one of the big rent-burdened types of places.
Right. I think Minneapolis is probably like medium rent burdened. I think many people can't afford to live well here, and it still remains relative to a lot of coastal cities, for example, more affordable, although that's changing as it is everywhere. I mean, I think for me, that's something that I really want to highlight for folks, is to think about, a big fear that I have is that actually the level of destruction in this neighborhood paves the way for gentrification. So gentrification, is somewhat of a concern here, and a thing for people to be wary of. It has not been happening at like lightning speed as it does in some places, or as it is in some places right now. But I mean, I just saw a tally that was 66 buildings burned to the ground, most of those in the East Lake corridor. There's the question of whether the city will rebuild, and then after that, the question of who they will rebuild for. And I think that this is a moment of a disaster capitalism, where a threat of gentrification that was not, as imminent for us a week and a half ago is now a real thing that we have to grapple with. And I think about the question of kind of whether this is people burning their own neighborhood down. It's complicated. And I will say that, as I was saying, the protests have been hugely diverse, and that means that there have been many people from the neighborhood at those protests. But I've been out there, I was out there every day for the first 5 nights, and I am confident that it was not all people from the neighborhood, based on talking to people, based on overhearing people talking, based on the non-stop line of shiny new cars lined up coming into my neighborhood every day, that it was not just people who live here, and I think there's a really important question to ask about, like, who gets to decide to burn down a neighborhood, and this is a neighborhood that is majority people of color, is one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, and it is not this neighborhood on its own that decided to torch all the infrastructure that people support, depend on.
Right. Did there was some kind of report, I don't know if it was a news report or just a rumor on social media, which I am now about to spread further, but there was something I heard yesterday about the ex-girlfriend of an undercover cop exposing her ex-boyfriend because she recognized that he was the first person to smash the glass in a building in the urban disturbances there, and then she wanted to expose him at presumably great personal risk to herself in terms of the legal implications. But did you hear anything about this, or is that just some kind of rumor mill thing? I imagine you would have heard about it first if it over there.
Yeah, I haven't heard that one. I don't know if you have, Garrett, but I mean, there's a lot of stuff like that going around, and I will say, like, I mean, with the rumors of like provocateurs and white supremacists, I'm sure some of it is true, right? And I think particularly as the situation kind of went on and as things continue to sort of unravel in a really unhinged way, I think that those sorts of forces come in and take advantage of that. So I don't want to diminish that might be a factor at play, but I can speak to my personal experience being out on the streets, that the majority of what I saw was not being done by people that could be classified as disinterested third parties or provocateurs or white supremacists. I think
people were very upset for a lot of whatever reasons.
Yeah.
Garrett, any you heard anything about any particular right-wing activity that keeps getting rumored?
I had heard that specific story, and I had heard that they called that person out as a former St. Paul or current St. Paul officer, and that St. Paul denied it. I don't think that there's hard evidence really one way or another, and we might never know for sure. And I think it's really, the question is, what's the impact, and how is the impact different depending on who is the action taker? And so is the same action taken as a true expression of rage around police violence righteous, whereas like when that action is made by a provocateur, it is not righteous? Maybe. I don't know. I mean, it's certainly not righteous when it's by a provocateur, but like, I think I'm more interested in talking about the impact. I'm more interested in talking about how do we move forward in transformation into a new future together, and less on dwelling on the specifics of, what were the, who did this specific act and what was their motivation for doing it. Because it's going to be messy, and there's going to be some things that we just never know. And I think it's easy to want to like get hung up on, the bad stuff, the stuff that doesn't feel good happened because of bad people. And we can like draw this line that like, bad people did the bad things and good people did the good things. And then now we understand the balance of the universe. And I think actually the reality of the situation is that people are grief stricken with the things that are happening to their neighborhood and not saying it shouldn't have happened. I think there's a lot of the businesses that have been affected have put out statements, but I think there's been a lot of reference to Gandhi Mahal, that's like a restaurant right there, right by the 3rd precinct that suffered a significant amount of damage. And, they're independent and a beloved part of the neighborhood. I get food there all the time, and I will continue to if and when they reopen. And they specifically put out a statement saying, that like, we will rebuild and George Floyd won't come back. And that it's really important to refocus this back on why people are there. And I've sort of, with some people I've been talking to, been sort of equating it to almost like a medical procedure, where it's like, if you are having cancer removed from your body, you're going to have a scar. If you are sick, you might have to take some bitter medicine. And that what's important is that you move to a place of being healthier from that. And I think that sort of echoes a little bit of what Luce is saying about now resisting the disaster capitalism, now resisting the gentrification, to say, what we want is to transform into a healthier society through this. And so let's focus on the future. Let's focus on how our societal body is going to thrive and be strong and healthy and strong together. And just like, I don't have the mental energy or interest in thinking about whether or not someone the first rock was thrown by a provocateur, because I'm not interested in delegitimizing the things that happened as genuine expressions of anger and frustration, even if it might not have happened without someone else doing it first. If that gave people permission to exercise this toxicity from their bodies, from their psyches, then I think that I have a hard time saying that that's 100% bad. And much like the outside agitator stuff around the RNC, I agree that like there's with Luce that there's a lot of questions to ask and things people should be pondering about who has claim of ownership to burn down what in whose neighborhood, and also how do we hold with that police brutality is not a uniquely Lake Street issue. And so it becomes a flashpoint for this issue, and people that are fed up with police brutality see here is a place where we can begin to take action to shape something different, and they come to do that. And I don't want to be in the business of saying you don't live in this neighborhood and your outrage towards this police conduct is illegitimate. I think there's a lot of stakeholders, and being a part of the neighborhood is only one way to have stake in that.
Yeah. I do think, though, that we have to be honest about the impact, like you said, and who's feeling that impact, right? And the reality is it's not Oakdale, where that cop lives, that's feeling this impact. Right. It's, back to Gandhi Mahal, which is, yes, like a beloved local progressive institution that also has tremendous support from the white progressive community of South Minneapolis. Most businesses in South Minneapolis don't have that, and most of the more marginalized communities that have lost all of this don't actually have the social safety net that a business like Gandhi Mahal has. And so I also want to be wary of the sort of token business owners that are getting put out there to say, hey, don't worry about me, I can rebuild, because it's not true for everyone that this has happened to that they can rebuild. And it's not true for everyone in this neighborhood that they have the actual safety net or the resilience to be able to withstand the impact until whatever is rebuilt, And I think we have to really be careful not to enter into the territory of two wrongs make a right, that your legitimate rage about police violence isn't an excuse to burn down the critical infrastructure that supports the lives of other people who also themselves face daily disenfranchisement, and the fact that this happened in this neighborhood is also because the city abandoned the neighborhood. And that in and of itself is about white supremacy and capitalism.
It's, the whole question of these kinds of uprisings and how messy they are and how much destruction is involved in the process of people expressing rage and making points and whatever else is going on. I mean, it's yeah. The like one of the things that always happens is there's always people determining who is who are the stakeholders and who aren't, who is who's local and who's not, and these things all get defined in many different ways depending on when it's convenient for different people to make this determination. Like, I mean, of course it can be done in so many different ways, but I wonder if I mean, and then of course the one thing that is never talked about, which seems relevant, also is just the logistics involved with, I mean, people might think it's, you could get accused of, you could probably be breaking laws by talking about it in too much detail, actually. But if you're trying to burn down a police station, if anybody has ever been involved with a fire department or in any situation where a building or you're trying to set a fire, if you don't have fire trucks around, even if you do have fire trucks around, a controlled burn is a very challenging thing to do, and other buildings can easily get damaged. And if and if it's the middle of the night, I mean, I'm just it's the logistics of any kind of situation like this are going to be so messy, right? And it's always, I'm not, which isn't a question. It's just
right. And I think it's also important for people to think about, for folks that were out there, to be honest about what they actually witnessed with themselves. To think about, if you've been in situations like that, whether people in those moments of intense rioting and destruction, whether they are actually always being guided by proactive concern for, human life and well-being. And I won't say that I saw that a whole lot in that, in that level of destruction. There's a lot of drunkenness, a lot of people amped up on rage and other things, a lot of cars careening out of control all over the place, a lot of that stuff kind of fueling this in a way that, I think it's like there's a difference between acknowledging the validity of people's rage or anger about the racist police state and affirming what they do with that anger. And I think, we have to be honest with that for ourselves. We have to be able to talk about that with that level of nuance, to say that, an unfortunate fact of capitalist society is that it makes many of us do a lot of really awful things,
It reminds me that your description of some of the people there, it kind of reminds me a lot of like the way things are after a big football game, like how some people will just take advantage of the pandemonium that can sometimes result from winning a football game in certain cities in the country, and then just drunk people doing all kinds of stuff that they would normally not do, like destroying each other's cars and whatever else. Like,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the things this reminds me of too is that when Margaret Thatcher said there's no such thing as society, which has become such a famous quote in England, when people are talking about these sorts of events, and is it a reflection of decades of austerity budgets and neoliberalism and racism and everything else that ultimately compounds into a situation where lots of people don't feel like they're in a society that they're really part of?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's any way you can take honest stock of what's happened along East Lake and say that people were truly thinking about the impacts on the community as they were doing those things. And maybe a lot of that comes from a lack of sense of belonging to a community, so I mean, there's a lot to dig into there for sure.
Yeah. Do you have any, here's another one of these terrible open-ended and impossible questions, but do you have any predictions for what's going to be going on over the next few weeks in any different areas, not specifically in terms of protest activity, but just any predictions at all? how things are going to be playing out, just in terms of the pandemic, the lockdown, the police, the local government, the national government, whatever comes to mind. I'm just looking for predictions of any kind.
I feel like I like to make predictions about things and like to guess at what's going to happen, and I've just like consistently been wrong this week. So I just
right. I mean, that's very traditional. Leftist intellectuals are always wrong with their predictions, but I still like to ask.
Okay, so I mean, I would say one thing that from the beginning I have been waiting to have happen, and I think maybe we're going to start seeing, is the style of policing that's been happening here for the past, well, since the RNC, maybe before, is very much rooted in sort of like this deep intel gathering focusing on intel gathering during something happening, and then more investigation after. So I think that there's like a good chance that there will be investigation both from the local law enforcement as well as we're already seeing some like federal law enforcement investigation. So I think in terms of so I think we aren't seeing, even when the demonstrations are done, we're still going to see more people probably getting arrested. We're going to see law enforcement, part of their gaining control back of the city is then going to be going through and trying to like pursue these leads from all the Instagram footage, all the CCTV stuff that's out there. There's a lot of data to look through. And maybe it's too much. Maybe they will only focus on some major things because there's just almost too much of it to go through. I don't know. But I think that we are going to see at least some amount of continued investigation and sort of repression of this uprising. My hope, what we've seen in terms of some of the community response, in terms of communities coming together actually rather rapidly to build emergency infrastructure, block watch groups that have way more of an abolitionist tone to them than I've ever seen in South Minneapolis, which like is a progressive place, but there's a lot of like middle of the road progressives who just want to have like a good relationship with the police. And I think, to be a few blocks off Lake Street, where it's whiter, where it's there's not as much economic diversity, it's more solidly middle class, to have people saying, hey, how could we keep doing this in a way that doesn't allow the police back into our neighborhood, I think is like a really awesome and inspiring thing to see. And I hope that that sort of train of thought continues and that people don't sort of settle back into business as usual kind of mentality. And then also I think some of what Luce touched on about the businesses that are going to be struggling, and sort of what I said about the body getting strong again. I think that we have, as a community here, and as anyone who's impacted by this, a lot of work to do in trying to push back against that disaster capitalism, push back against gentrification, and making sure that the communities most negatively impacted by these past events are actually the ones that come out stronger for it. And that's going to take a lot of work. And I'm going to put that intention out into the universe with hope that that the people who have access to resources in these communities are able to rise to that challenge and help mobilize those resources to help the most impacted.
Yeah, I do think there is a lot of trauma coming out of this. And I think maybe in some ways compounded by this very strange situation of having been, in the midst of this pandemic, having many folks having been, extremely isolated at the moment that this started, and then kind of erupting into this week and a half of collectivity, good and bad, and so I think it will be a real struggle for folks moving out of this to kind of retreat back into that level of isolation in regards to the pandemic, and yet still try to figure out how to engage in some of those really necessary collective efforts, and to actually deal with and support people dealing with the trauma that they're actually carrying right now and carrying out of this situation. And I think that in some ways is really unprecedented, that combination of this sort of thing happening in the middle of a pandemic and figuring out, how to deal with it without the most basic tools of like, human companionship and in-person collectivity. So
the distinction between police reform and police abolition seems extremely significant in this situation and in general. Like, I mean, we come up against this whole question anytime there's this kind of constant police brutality, which never ends, no matter how much they reform police departments, right? I mean, this is something that finally they're talking about in the corporate media, that all these efforts at police reform haven't done anything to reform the police. And it seems, obviously, although people aren't necessarily talking about why that is, but it seems fairly obvious to any of us on this screen right here, I would say that, and many other people, that the problem is the system that they're defending. Obviously, you have to, if you're going to be making life unaffordable and impossible for half of the society, then you have to have violent enforcers of the law to keep that half of the society in place. Otherwise, they're going to want cheaper rent and free healthcare or something. But I wonder if, I mean, it's again a very open-ended, vague question, but is there any ray of hope for actual systemic change? It sounds like some people beyond the circles of anarchists and other radicals are starting to figure out this concept of abolition. It's been talked about for decades or centuries, but yeah. I wonder where does that seem to be getting off the ground in any way, or it's hard to say?
No, I mean, it does in a lot of ways. And, I feel some wariness about what that actually means as well. The Minneapolis City Council is having conversations right now about defunding the police department or dismantling the police department. And, there are a lot of different groups in town that have been pushing on that for, the past several years, that are, really coming into their moment to talk about what that could look like. I think a thing that gives me pause is that what I've observed in a lot of those conversations around abolition is this idea of police abolition rather than abolition as an abolition of those systemic, of those systems, right? And so I see a lot of like, don't call the cops, call social workers instead. And I think, as anarchists, we need to hold people accountable to the fact that different arms of the state serve the same purpose, and so to be very wary of whether we're creating or contributing to this moment where people are using the term abolition actually to reinforce other kind of more refined or more hegemonic aspects of the state. I don't know that that's what's going to happen, but I know that amongst groups that have really come to the forefront in this conversation in Minneapolis, that tends to be the political bent. And so I hope that people start to engage more critically with not just, the police as we see them in police uniforms, but all the different arms of the state that actually keep people down every day. And I hope that there is actual, real, serious conversation about the underlying conditions that actually make people want the police. I think like what we saw in, on the East Lake corridor this past week was as clear proof as there's ever been that the police aren't there when you need them. And yet what I hear from all the neighbors that I engage with is not that they don't want someone to help keep them safe, and not that there aren't real reasons that they need that level of protection. And so I hope that in those conversations around police abolition that are happening, people are willing to be honest about the interpersonal harm and the interpersonal violence that actually exists, especially in a neighborhood like this, day in and day out. And that those are hard problems to solve, and part of why we've allowed, the police to kind of be the de facto response is because we haven't been able to come up with something better. And I think that's a little different than what some people are saying, which is like, we have the answers, we just need the funding to enact them. And I don't think we have the answers. I think that's not true. So some honesty and some self-reflection, I think would be really helpful in that conversation. But yeah, I mean, people are talking about abolition. People are talking about dismantling the police department. You know, I mean, that in and of itself is momentous.
It seems like if such a thing were to take place, obviously, I mean, what people may or may not want to talk about is that, of course, that would mean a complete destabilization of society, and which, you know, would be which would inevitably have potentially extremely positive and extremely negative consequences, or both, or neither. I mean, it's so impossible to say exactly what would happen, because it's not going to happen that way. Actually, as we know, they're not going to abolish the police, and because if they did, they'd be abolishing capitalism in the process, and they don't care about all those victims of violence in homes and all over. That's not why they have the police in the first place, right? It's just why they tell us that they have the police, but that's not really why they're there, and they're not going to get rid of them. But it's very interesting to talk about, I think, because it's like it sort of exposes the functioning of the system. What prison abolition, police abolition, well, you know, how would that work? You know, we need those institutions to keep people in line, don't we? And if not, then what do we do? You know,
right. And what it demands is that we actually step up to take responsibility for solving the deep problems that exist in society and in how people relate to each other, you know.
Which is a very complex and you know, web of relationships, isn't it? It's not. We don't live in a society where a few people have everything, and everybody else are you know, starving peasants or something. It's more complex than that.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
I think there's some great like graphics out there that have been put together about like what types of change are changes that move us towards abolition versus moving us away from it. And I think that the fact that people are that sort of becoming the yardstick for legitimacy of change is a really amazing, great step. And so the fact that we're thinking, okay, you know, for example, the community policing, I feel like while there are you know, day-to-day things that are better in people's lives from that, ultimately, if that's like a technique for building legitimacy of the police and taking power away from the people and making the police seem like they need to be there, then that's not necessarily a reform worth fighting for. But if we're talking about like limiting the scope of what the police do, decriminalizing certain types of behavior, getting rid of cash bail, you know, having police under higher scrutiny, you know, just having an eye towards, with everything we do, limiting their role more and more and more and shrinking it. And then, I mean, my hope would be that as we're doing that, we are able to build out sort of more community-minded abolitionist infrastructure to fill those spaces, because it is too big of a task with how hurt people are in the society right now, with how much inequity there is. You know, it's a monumental task to say, snap your fingers, the police are gone, and now what are we going to do? And to some degree, we saw ourselves have to do that over the past week. So it can be done, but it's messy and it hurts. And it's hard to sustain. I think the level to the idea that people would sustain, you know, every neighbor out on their front stoop till 4 a.m. every night indefinitely, you know, that's not the life people want to be living. So we have to figure out how we can chip away at the police and replace it with other things, and continue to keep that abolitionist framework and prism that we're looking through when we're judging whether or not the change is what we want to see. So if we got rid of MPD and the Hennepin County Sheriff's Department expanded to meet all those needs, you know, that's obviously, I'm not interested in that at all. That's not what I'm fighting for.
Are there any mutual aid projects in particular that we can point people to that they might find online that are going on that in particular?
It's kind of a weird thing to say, but I don't think money is actually what people need at this moment. I think millions and millions of dollars have poured into this community over the past week, and that's it's an amazing show of support. And yet the fact of the matter is that organizations have more money than they're able to use well.
Right.
And I think, as I mentioned earlier, my ongoing concern is whether and how this neighborhood is rebuilt and for whom. And I think, in regards to, this neighborhood and in more proactive efforts to address, state violence, that struggle is ongoing. I think it makes sense to kind of, support things locally where you're at if they have that need right now, or to kind of hold off and wait for the opportunity to actually provide resources in a way that they can be used well. Because right now it's not clear that people can actually use more money. I don't, a lot of places have actually stopped taking donations. So
wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And similar to thinking about ways to abolish the police, I think that a lens that we can use for a lot of this is just trying to think about who's most impacted, and how do we how can, if we're less impacted or whatever, how can we buttress the self-organizing of those folks, or collaborating with those folks. And so I guess I would encourage people that have a genuine deep interest in helping out with what's going on in Minneapolis to not stop paying attention, and be there when these small businesses on the Lake Street corridor are figuring out how they want to move forward, so that they can be resourced in returning to being the vital part of the neighborhood that they have been, and bloom into something greater than they've been before. And that's what's gonna help all of this transformation feel like the caterpillar became the butterfly, that we're gonna come out of it and we're gonna be stronger than we were before. So don't stop paying attention.
And don't stop paying attention to the communities that are impacted by this. And so, I think to really highlight that it's not just about the businesses, it's about the people that live here and the infrastructure they actually need to live here and to live here well, and so is businesses to a certain extent, but it's community organizations, it's physical spaces. I mean, it's access to needed life supplies. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Luce and Garrett, thank you so much for joining me for this discussion. It's been a great little beginning to talk about what's happening. And thanks for taking the time out of your days.
No problem.
Thanks for having us.
And I would just want to say that, the world is run by bullies, and they're also big and mean. But the world was made for all of us, so we're going to change this scene.
I wonder who said that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
And thanks so much, everybody out there, for joining us in today's conversation with Luce and Garrett. On Monday, I'll be hosting the 7th weekly Pandemic Open Mic Monday. You can sign up at davidrovics.com/POMM. Then on Tuesday through Friday, more interviews with very interesting people. I have a new album out on Bandcamp as of 2 nights ago, called Notes from a Failed State, mostly made up of songs I wrote over the past few weeks, including my latest composition, As I Watch Minneapolis Burn. It's free to stream on Bandcamp. Hope to see you again soon here in the Matrix and in the streets. Don't pay the rent. Don't be afraid of your neighbors. Mutual aid will get us through.